time.
Actually automatically connected.
How Oh, is that what that's for? I thought it was reading. Because some people hold the papers up like that. That was pretty good. You know what I didn't do today? I forgot to vote.
No, you didn't.
We didn't have anything on the ballot, did we?
School board members and council trustees, but they were unopposed.
I didn't vote for anybody. There was 2 for the Board of Education.
They need a board, a big one.
Board of Education, I like
The
it.
only thing we had that mattered was a school tax.
Oh, we had the school tax.
We had a renewal.
Did you?
on
What our kids need. The Board of Education applied to the seat of knowledge.
Exactly.
Need parents to have it considered. Okay, what can I say?
Yes.
Yeah, we voted yesterday.
What, water or lemonade?
Oh, did you? You can vote yesterday?
Lemonade would be good.
Yeah, I didn't know if they shut it off the day before or not. I've been able to do it early for about a month.
You're scared. You're scared.
How are you doing tonight?
Good.
How you doing on the basement?
Good.
Yeah.
The guy just came in and he waterproofed one side of the wall.
Yeah.
So they have the concrete wall poured and it's dry enough.
Possible voters.
Did he go down further where like you had that mud coming in?
So, I couldn't imagine if
He
he
put
was
a wall
there.
cave in, and then there was
Only
like
4
a
people were on the
wood
ballot. They were all
divider, and then
opposed.
over here you had like
No issues.
mud running in.
I didn't know any of
Where's the wood
it.
divider?
Yeah.
Where was it in your analogy?
Well, in my head,
In your head?
from my memory, where I go like you had a broke a wall that caved in right here. Here's the corner,
Okay.
Oh, wait.
and then inside the basement,
Wait, I think I might
and
have
then
one.
you go way over to
Where did
the
I
right
put that?
along that same stretch, and there's like mud coming
Oh,
on.
yeah. Here we go.
Did they tear all that out?
Yeah, they did. Mhm.
Okay.
Oh,
We got all.
I didn't have to worry about daylight savings time in my day.
It was leaching.
The dinosaur saving.
Got a haircut, didn't you?
That's because they didn't have watches.
There's my glasses.
I don't know how many people I've heard
And
talk
sundial.
about the
They
day
did?
being longer.
Hey, there's one in Greenville.
The day was
What?
no
The
longer.
A sundial.
Oh.
The dinosaur in Greenville.
Day
Yep, at
longer.
Greenville. Actually, there might have been watches.
On the wrist?
Yeah, they were big and huge. Pocket watch. They had yes. They put on their skeleton.
Started winding down about the time sun went down.
They didn't have pockets.
They
Where
didn't
they
have pockets
keep all
in
their
the, they didn't keep, they kept their money in the other
The
place.
back of their ear? Or in their ear? They could put on their small T-Rex.
I know, right?
Okay, done this before.
Too many
How
chairs
much
in this
daylight did you say?
Totally my fault.
Exactly, exactly.
You guys need something?
All right, it's 6 o'clock. Let's go ahead and get started. Oh, I need my amplification.
Get that citation. Actually, what do you mean?
This wireless mic is based on the laws of science. Evolution, on the other hand, not so much.
Somebody make a joke. We didn't have wood, but they had. We didn't have wood, got
An asteroid flying from the air.
and volcanoes and earthquakes.
Whoa. All right, I guess that means we're on. Take your Bibles, if you would, open up to 1 Timothy chapter 6 and verse 20. 1 Timothy chapter 6 and verse 20. First Timothy chapter 6 and verse 20. Somebody read that verse to me, if you would. Who wants to read it? All right, go ahead, Brother Mike.
O Timothy, keep that which is committed to thy trust. avoiding profane and vain babblings in opposition of science falsely so called.
All right, and somebody read me verse 21. Who else is there? All right, Brother Adam.
Which some professing have erred concerning the faith, grace be with you.
All right, so this, we've been talking about evolution for a long time. This is actually going to be our last class on the icons of evolution. We're going to go 2 classes in a row on proofs of creation. So we're going to attack it from the other direction after this. I think we've successfully deconstructed the idea that everything came about by evolution. It is a scientific impossibility. Today's is no different either. But probably the most, the best evidence that I've seen that we've went through so far is the DNA evidence against evolution, because you have to have information in order for there to be information downstream. So information always comes from somewhere, never comes from nothing. And so, but this as well was one of the major things that were in the textbooks to argue about evolution, and it convinced a large number of Christians to actually turn away from biblical creationism and turn to evolution as a fact as it's taken in the schools now. Now we know it's not a fact. We've seen enough evidence against it, but most of the world still takes it as fact. The Bible tells us that there was a day and age, and actually every day and age apparently, because Paul's warning Timothy about this in 1 Timothy chapter 6 and verse 20, when he says that there will be profane and vain babblings. Now right in with that, you could of course expound on that if you were teaching, right? Profane, what is it to be profane? What is vanity? So what would a vain babbling be, right? These are meaningless words that are put out there, but right in there with that is oppositions of science falsely so called. Now science has attacked biblical Christianity for 2 centuries in the Western world, and probably even longer than that if you want to go back to the beginnings of the Enlightenment. But certainly we live in a day and age when oppositions of science falsely so called are given. I think that if everybody was to be able to see all the evidence as we have with regard to the invalidity of evolution, that they'd be convinced that yes, evolution could not have happened. And in fact, we're starting to see a bit of a turn in that in our day and age, where they're throwing out Darwinism, and they're saying, well, yes, of course it changes. Science always changes. And you see these arguments put out that as we discover more, of course, the theories will change. But the fact is, they have placed evolution firmly in the realm of fact, and they have successfully made cartoons and taught our children, and all of this. It's been very, very concerted effort to get our children to believe in evolution for the very one and main purpose that it discounts God having created everything. And when we have God, we are now accountable to the one that created everything. We should seek out who that one is that created everything if we believe in the opposite side of this issue. In your day, some of you younger people, there may be a time when evolution is discarded. However, there won't be a turn to God at that point. It will be another new fact that they present in terms of being an alternative to believing in God. As evolution is being torn down in our day, guess what? They're building up something else. We're seeing some really strange theories out there. One of them's going to get hold, and that'll be the next big thing to evolution. Darwinism is just about dead. Major mainstream scientists are starting to discard Darwinism as Darwin put it. Now they won't throw out the baby with the bathwater. They're still holding on to evolution. But actual Darwinism, natural selection, and these sort of things are starting to go by the wayside. I'd encourage you, even after this class, to pay attention to the direction that science goes. There are a number of good Christian scientist organizations that give you the other side of the issue, and Answers in Genesis would be one. That's a more popular, fun one, right, for kids and a lot of things. ICR, Institute for Creation Research, is one that actually puts out good, serious scholarly papers. Creation Ministries International is another good one that you can get books from. Are those the ones that did that devotional that we got for the family devotional? That was out of Michigan, Creation Ministries International. They're putting out some good stuff as well. And this is going to continue to be an issue in our day. Now, this Miller experiment that we're talking about today, this was a very influential experiment that finally gave, as all of these others have, finally gave evolution the credibility that it needed. The actual finding of something that they could latch onto to say, look, here we figured out how it all started. Now, I'm going to tell you from the very start with regard to the Miller experiment that now they are starting to separate the Miller experiment from evolution because the Miller experiment has shown to be false. We'll look at that today. First of all, though, let's open up with the word of prayer. And then we'll take a look at the primordial soup. Any of you all eating primordial soup this evening? Yeah. Well, essentially, yes. It has a lot of nutrients in it, so that's what they're talking about. So we all ate primordial soup today. All right, let's pray, and then we'll get started. Heavenly Father, we do thank you for this day. And Lord, I pray that as we continue to study through these things, that you'd help us to see what really is true. Lord, we know that there are some that are ever learning and never come to the knowledge of the truth. But we also know, Lord, that we can have the truth through your word if we'll only accept what you said. In Jesus' name we pray. Amen. Well, in 1953, Stanley Miller, the University of Chicago, he performed a scientific experiment that actually became one of the biggest icons of evolution out there. And one of the reasons we're dealing with it last is because it's the most involved of all of them. You will find that this one is used on a regular basis to show this proposition, that something can come from nothing. That life itself can be brought about simply because of an exchange of molecules. And Miller, when he performed this experiment, he was simply a graduate student at his University of Chicago. And he was in the laboratory of Harold Urey. So sometimes this is called the Miller-Urey experiment or Urey-Miller experiment. And when he was working in this particular laboratory, there was a theory that came about by Harold Urey, who was the guy running the laboratory, that he theorized that the original atmosphere of the Earth was such that it would allow the formation of organic compounds, which produce a prebiotic soup. Now imagine you set out some sort of mix of organic chemicals, and we'll get to the frog in the blender instance here in a little bit, but say you set out a mix of chemicals, and they're not chemically bonded together particularly strongly, so after you let it sit out for a while, what happens? Stuff settles on the bottom. And what they're saying is that eventually stuff would start having interaction together, and that there would be things that would be formed that would be precursors to life. They theorized the original atmosphere was just right for this, and therefore life assembled itself, and assembled the building blocks anyway of life that then began interacting and causing life to come about. Now folks, this belief in self-assembling life, this is much more faith than we have in a creator God. We see creation, we can test creation, we understand design, and we see design even to the smallest and lowest levels, down to the atomic level we see design. And so we understand that a design must have a designer. There's much more evidence for a designer than there is that life brought itself and assembled itself together. What they're wanting you to believe in is a resurrection from death unto life. Now this is a false resurrection. They want you to believe that dead chemicals all came together and eventually produced life. And this is a counterfeit, by the way. So anyway, that's what we're going to look at today, is this particular study. Yes, go ahead, brother.
He done all this. Where did he get the chemicals from?
Well, we're going to get to that. Yes, good, excellent point. We're going to get to that. And that's one of the ways we can deconstruct this particular experiment, is that, okay, expound on that real quick, because you've already got the idea. with regard to this experiment and how it can be torn down. What was wrong with this experiment in showing how life began?
Honey, it's just like somebody said, I'm gonna make a new world, and God said, well, you're gonna have to make your own dirt. You know,
Well, exactly. So what had to be applied to this experiment in order for it to be successful, even if it was successful, which it wasn't ultimately? Intelligence.
Oh, yeah.
He had to bring everything together in a just so way in order for it to happen, right? It didn't just randomly happen in his laboratory, no. He had to actually apply his intelligence. So even if this worked, even if he was able to bring about life in a test tube, it would still be an example of designed and applied intelligence. His own applied intelligence. So even the very fact that he did this experiment proves that life coming about must have had an intelligent design and creator to set up the right test tube properties in order to bring it about. Now, that's great. We've just done away with the whole thing. But there are details in this that now we need to study and take a look at to show how it, even though if he would have succeeded, it would have been a failure for evolution. Even though they say he succeeded, he actually did not succeed in bringing about life in a test tube at this time, and they're not going to, by the way. This idea was proposed by Alexander Oberon and J.B.S. Haldane. These guys were communists. Let's just throw that around, right? These guys were communists, and they were attempting to disprove creationism. But these guys were literal communists attempting to disprove creationism. Now, if you guys recall what communism did, especially in the Soviet Union, they wanted a completely secular society, right? And so this was the motive behind this experiment. Go ahead.
What did they blame to life?
Well, you'll see here in just a moment.
That's what I
See here in just a
What
moment.
life? What did they blame to life?
So their theory was this, that the early Earth was composed in an atmosphere of methane, hydrogen, ammonia, and water vapor. Now, they had a problem here, though. They had to say that there would be little or no free oxygen. And I got to say this, in my studies on this, there would have to be zero oxygen. What does oxygen do in an environment that is of assembled molecules? That oxygen will attack that and it will break it down. It'll attach itself to it. Highly oxygenated things can actually be very corrosive in a way. They attach themselves to things. Oxygen is good for us, but it's really bad for molecules. As a matter of fact, your car can prove this, right? Got a 1998 Chevy van that's, I think, held together by rust right now. But that's oxygen attacking the metal and binding itself with that metal to make what? To make iron oxide, which is rust. And so that's what you have. Oxygen just sticks to everything. So this had to be a thing without oxygen in the early atmosphere. They didn't propose these compositions because they had evidence of this composition of an atmosphere. They actually chose this mix of gases because they knew this would be the most likely to produce complex organic chemicals. All right, well, then again, there we have that same original problem that we were talking about, right? They had to apply intelligence and a proper exact mix of chemicals in order to get things to come together, which means what? Which means that this experiment, by definition, was intelligence designed. They weren't basing this on any sort of science evidence, old rocks finding trapped air in old sediments or anything like that to find out what the primordial atmosphere content was. That had nothing to do with it. The reason they chose the chemicals that they chose was because they knew it would give them the greatest success of forming more complex molecules. So that right there completely invalidates this study because they weren't even making a guess as to what was in that original atmosphere. So what they did is they put these things together. They put them in a sealed off testing device that was made out of glass. There was some rubber on one end. I've seen a picture of this particular device, and we may even have it in our PowerPoint. But what they did is they filled that with the gas. It didn't have any oxygen in it, and so they circulated it within that glass tube. and then they had electrodes going in there, and they shocked it to simulate what it would have been like for lightning. Now, this is what they were proposing, that there were all of these organic chemicals and gases, or inorganic chemicals and gases that were floating around, and lightning struck, created some amino acids, which assembled themselves then into proteins, which assembled themselves eventually into living cells. And that's the entirety of the issue here. That's the entirety of what they were trying to do. Urey had concluded that the O'Parent-Haldane theory was correct. So the theory was put out there. They said, yes, that is correct. And now we need to prove it in the laboratory. Does anybody see a problem with that? Built-in confirmation bias, right? Think about this for a second. If you're expecting an outcome, generally speaking, you'll find that outcome. This wasn't a scientific test. These were people that believed in the theory, and now they were going to give proof to that theory, as opposed to letting the science speak for what it would. So they set up everything for success with regard to this experiment, because they knew if they could make it happen the way they wanted to make it happen, that it would provide proof for evolution. And it did. They were able to provide proof for evolution, but it was based on the fact that they were going to find what they were going to find regardless. The Miller-Urey experiment consisted of the creation of a gaseous environment to simulate the alleged atmosphere of the early Earth, with the insertion of the electric charge, like I was talking about, to simulate lightning. In the Dynamics of Life, this is a Mural biology book in 1991, it says this: Miller and Urey placed a mixture of gases into a flask containing water. These gases were in the proportions believed present in the primitive atmosphere of Earth. The flask was subjected to electrical sparks that simulated lightning. Miller and Urey also repeatedly heated and cooled the mixture, simulating changes in daily temperatures. Now, the claim was made by evolutionists that the mystery of life's origin had been solved. Oh, by the way, there's the slide with the Prentice Hall biology textbook. And it was, for half a century, this was used as proof of evolution from life, or from non-life to life. They had done it. They had found the incontrovertible evidence that by chance molecules could assemble themselves together and create the precursors of life. The New Scientist magazine said this. It said, in the beginning, life assembled itself. This was on February 27th, 1969, in the magazine New Scientist. Life assembled itself. Now, what we have here is, with the Miller experiment, we have these different things with it. First of all, it's based on evolutionary assumptions. Second of all, Miller used the wrong materials. Third, Miller added unnatural elements to the experiment. In other words, it was completely guided by intelligence, that's funny, actually. Miller got the wrong results. You say, but I thought he came up with amino acids. Hold on, we'll deal with that in a minute. Life in a test tube would only prove that intelligence is required to create life, right? We discussed that. The modern science of genetics has falsified the idea of life arising from non-life. Now, we're going to deal with each of these things tonight. This is going to be a little bit longer than usual, maybe 10 minutes longer than usual, so just hang with me. But we're going to get to the point to where we can start on the proofs of creation next week, all right? So first of all, the Miller experiment is based on evolutionary assumptions. You know, this whole experiment assumes a universe and assumes the primordial soup in which molecules could evolve into life, but science has not proven that the universe and the earth have happened by chance, naturalistic means. In other words, they have just given hypotheses that they are now trying to test in the experiments. That is the way that science works, but you can't make the assumption that the universe and the earth had this particular composition of chemicals in order to bring this about. The Big Bang, multiverses, but these are not scientific facts. Those are just assumptions made in order to try to build science upon that. the Miller experiment is actually meaningless apart from evolutionary assumptions. So what they've done, they mixed a bunch of stuff, they shocked it with electricity, and they came up with a rearrangement of the molecules, which, okay, that makes sense. You could do that. But without the assumption of evolution, it really means nothing. There it is, kind of showing you how it was all set up. We've got the water vapor that forms here. This is a Bunsen burner here. And it goes up and it's distilled, and then you got the electrode. The water vapor comes in here where the H2, the CH4, and the NH3 are, and then it condenses, and then it comes back through and does it again. And they just keep it cycling. And well, they've got a P-trap in here is what we would call it, right? So all the heavy stuff would actually go down into here, and then the organic compounds come out there. Those are the new combinations of carbohydrates or hydrocarbons, not carbohydrates, hydrocarbons that come out, which would tell you something about what are you going to find mostly in this. If you've got, for those of you who have taken a little bit of chemistry, if you've got CH4, H2, and NH3, and water vapor, what are you going to end up with in this track? A whole lot of tar, a whole lot of hydrocarbons. And so that's it ended up being what they actually got when they did that. But there were a few molecules that were different, organic molecules that we'll take a look at that were a little bit different. All right, but the assumption is there that the universe and an earth and a primordial soup in which life could have happened. Science has not proven that the universe and earth could have happened by naturalistic causes. Michael Denton, a PhD in biochemistry, said, considering the way the prebiotic soup is referred to in so many discussions of the origin of life as an already established reality, it comes as something of a shock to realize that there is absolutely no positive evidence for its existence. Michael Denton, Evolution, Theory in Crisis, New Developments in Science are challenging preconceptions. Miller used the wrong materials for his experiment here. Scientists determined that an atmosphere of a supposed ancient Earth would not have been composed of the elements used in the experiment. They missed completely as to what would have been in there. Jonathan Wells, you remember him, he wrote Icons of Evolution. He said this, he said, for more than a decade, most geochemists have been convinced that the experiment failed to simulate conditions of the early Earth and thus has little or nothing to do with the origins of life. Here's the deal, the entire experiment's out the window if there's no possible way that the mix was what it was in primeval times, right? And so this completely invalidates the experiment 100% because it's not possible to have this mix at that time prior to life on this earth, even from what the other side says on this. Canadian geologists Eric Dimroth and Michael Kimberley wrote in 1979 that they saw no evidence that an oxygen-free atmosphere has existed at any time. And therefore, the experiment was invalid. It's unfortunate it's been used for nearly 70 years as a proof for evolution, because it doesn't even have the very first basic premise of having the correct atmosphere from which to start. So there was always oxygen. Throw oxygen in this mix, you know what happens? That oxygen breaks things down. You don't end up with amino acids if you have oxygen in here. But there's absolutely no evidence that we had an oxygen-free atmosphere at any time. British geologists Harry Clemmy and Mac Badham wrote in 1982 that from the time of the earliest dated rocks, Earth had an oxygenic atmosphere. Now, how can they know this? Well, they can actually test air bubbles within the rocks of the earliest formed basalt and things like that in the bottom of the Grand Canyon. There will be tiny trapped air bubbles that will give you the composition of what the air was like then if it hasn't reacted with the rock. It's far beyond my ability. I'm not a geologist, I'm not a chemist. I'm just saying that's how they tell us that they're able to find these things. They're able to see that every sample that they've ever had has had some oxygen in it. Geochemists soon reached a near consensus that the primitive atmosphere was nothing like the one Miller used. And that's a problem. That's a huge problem for the experiment. The experiment went wrong. The presence of oxygen would have destroyed anything that might have evolved. you had your very first single cell organisms. It would destroy the organisms. Why do you think that doctors and scientists want us to take antioxidants these days? Because oxygen actually destroys the cell if not properly channeled in a way that causes us to have life. I know it's a great mystery, it really is, but the fact is this, that extra oxygen, those free radicals is what they call them, right? Actually, supposedly causes a lot of destruction to your cells. Now imagine a single-celled organism that has just evolved and there's oxygen in the atmosphere. What would happen? Well, it would immediately attract that oxygen and would destroy the cell. Because something that would have evolved wouldn't have had the ability to evolve something that would deal with such a destructive force chemically in the world at that time. Michael Pittman taught biology at Cambridge. He said even the simple organic compounds, the smallest bricks of living material, would have crumbled as soon as they formed if oxygen were present. Atom and evolution. All right, so Miller used the wrong materials there, didn't he? There was never any evidence of an oxygen-free atmosphere. Oxygen would have attacked the very first thing that would have evolved out of that atmosphere, and therefore oxygen in the atmosphere precludes any sort of organic synthesis. All right? Any questions on that?
Is it because he didn't put oxygen, isn't oxygen explosive?
It is.
If we hit it with a spark, would it have exploded?
More than likely, although that would be an interesting experiment to do, Brother John. But just thinking off the cuff, and I'm sure a chemist could correct me on this, but I think the oxygen would more immediately bond with something else, such as the H4. Or the CH4, you would end up having it blending as opposed to
Well, you said told you, you make oxygen.
exploding. What happens in a burning process is the oxygen latches on to the hydrocarbon. And that's what causes that burning process, is because that oxygen is then taken up into the substance, and it burns. So that free oxygen running around will destroy organic chemicals. Free radicals is what they're called when they're in our body. Before the origin of life, when there were neither chemists nor laboratories, the chemical building blocks of life could have formed only in a natural environment, lacking oxygen. But we don't find that in the earliest air samples that we can get. All right, the Miller experiment added unnatural elements. This is a killer. This is probably the worst experiment that's ever been touted as true in the history of science. And I'm not overstating it, but I'm just saying this, that it's a bad study every way you look at it. The conditions of this experiment were not realistic. Normal conditions, hydrogen escapes into space, but Miller provided no way for that hydrogen to escape from this system. So the hydrogen had to keep getting looped back through and through and through, whereas in real life, not something made up, it's a sealed system like this, the hydrogen actually escapes into space. Under normal conditions, any soluble organic products that formed would quickly be broken down, but Miller precluded this by building a trap to prevent such an occurrence. So essentially, if that thing was just going around and around and around and didn't have this trap here, there would be no formation of the chemicals. And so that is another problem we have, because he applied intelligence to trap these things apart and separate from the loop. And that's how he ended up getting his organic chemicals out of that. Gary Parker, he has a doctorate in biology and geology. He said this: the same spark that puts amino acids together also tears them apart. So if those amino acids were allowed to circulate throughout that system, the next time they came through and got hit by that spark, it would then blow the amino acid apart, right? And so you wouldn't have any of this building up of amino acids and some sort of trap in the system if it was allowed to circulate properly. So the next lightning strike, the first lightning strike caused life. There we go, amino acids. Suddenly we're starting to assemble RNA and then DNA and then cells, except for the fact that the second lightning strike would have blown it all apart. Oops. Maybe it happened millions of times. Maybe they don't have enough time. Maybe they want to make it, the Earth's been around 10 billion years. We'll see how long it stretches out during you guys' lifetime. Because it keeps getting longer. these guys right here is like the Earth was 5 million years old when they were kids. Now it's a lot older. That's already how old they are, right?
Soup conducts too.
Soup conducts. Yeah, there'd be a lot of electrolytes in there when they're, so it would,
Get it?
you would get that electricity going throughout the entire system.
Yeah.
Anyway, that same spark would tear them apart. But Miller knew this. Miller understood this. He knew it. He knew this was going to be so. So what he did is he trapped out the molecules that he wanted. That's called selection. That's not natural selection, by the way. That is intelligently designed selection. He created a system that could not fail. He knew he was going to succeed. Why? Because he applied his intelligence to it. Which totally disproves that everything came about with a lack of intelligence, right? He couldn't even do a science experiment without applying intelligence to every single little aspect of this. So he trapped out the molecules he wanted. That would be cheating because you are supposed to say that this is how life arose without any intelligent design. Any questions on the Miller experiment adding unnatural elements to it? And by elements there we mean unnatural different portions of it, such as the trap. Right.
Would the water have also released oxygen, or, I mean, isn't there oxygen in water?
Yeah, well, I mean, the oxygen gets into the water through, sure, wave action and things like that, so the water would have contained oxygen.
H2O,
Okay.
Yep.
Would that have made it into the experiment then?
Yeah, it would have. You know what, and since they did the experiment without any oxygen at all, if there was oxygen in the air, which we know there had to have been oxygen in the air, according to all the findings of real science, then if there's oxygen in the air and there's wave actions, movement of air, then what you're going to end up with is oxygen in the water. Therefore, that oxygen in the water would do what to the amino acids that formed when the lightning struck the water of the primordial soup? That oxygen would immediately destroy anything that started to evolve and become an organic chemical. And by destroy, I mean that the oxygen would attach itself in a peculiar way to the chemicals that are in there. Again, I'm not a chemist, but what it would do is it would create a different chemical. And so amino acid, there it is, right there, ready to go, let's evolve, and then the oxygen that's being whipped into the water would take it out.
Yeah.
And it would cease to exist.
Wouldn't it take like it seems like it would take an extremely much bigger miracle for one amino acid to not get hit by the second lightning strike and to stay away from
Or any
oxygen.
subsequent lightning strike for millions of years, actually.
Yeah. Especially in conductive soup.
Yeah, with a lot of electrolytes in it, which we call it that because it's able to take electricity. So if it's an organic chemical that has a lot of electrolytes in it, and it was some sort of concentrated form, it would actually be able to conduct that electricity throughout the entire body of whatever concentrated form that it was. Lightning strikes are 5,000 degrees. I'm not sure how many joules of electricity come, or 50,000 degrees. I'm not sure how many joules of electricity come from an average lightning strike. But if you have life forming on some sort of shallow pool of water, that exposure, that difficulty, it would tear that lightning, the oxygen, everything combined, actually goes against life. It actually attacks it from a chemical sense, not out of means, you understand. Right. Any other questions on the added unnatural elements? All right. Well, Miller got the wrong results. All right, so the claim here is that Miller got right results, right? He was able to bring about life. In what way? Well, the very fun and exciting and amazing chemical amino acids. If you don't have amino acids, you die. Amino acids are what your proteins are consisted of. They do a number of different things in the cells in your body. It's very necessary that we have a certain type and a certain number of amino acids in order to have life. The Miller's results did not say that. There was nothing living. No living thing was in his primordial soup here. No protein was even created. You cannot have life without a protein. Nothing. None of this stuff. And like we said before, the main product of this experiment, as you could probably expect from the chemicals being added, was tar. So the guy figured out how to make tar very expensively, is what he did. Simon Morris called the products of these experiments muck, goo, and gunk. It had nothing to do with life. Graham Cairn Smith called them grossly contaminated gunks. What Miller actually produced was a poisonous brew that would destroy any hope for the chemical evolution of life. Again, you've got the electricity that would have killed any evolving life. Secondly, you've got what? Oxygen that would have killed any living life. Thirdly, you've just produced not primordial soup, you have just produced toxic waste that would destroy life. All these were going against life. They were grossly contaminated. The theistic evolutionary paleontologist Conway Morris, Simon Conway Morris, he said that, right? He called it muck, goo, and gunk, but that's what he was, a theistic evolutionary paleontologist. This was a very educated guy. This is in the book Jonathan Sarfati, By Design, page 170. I have this book if you'd like to see it. Trace amounts of amino acids that were produced were both left-handed and right-handed. Okay, so they were able to produce amino acids using this method of highly applied intelligent design. Boy, isn't this exciting? Highly applied intelligent design in this experiment. They were actually able to come up and produce an amino acid. They still had a problem. Great, they had amino acid, but they produced right-hand and left-hand amino acids. Now here's the difficulty with that. That's not good. How many of you all are right-handed? Am I the only left-handed person in the room, me and Joey?
I'm left-handed.
You're left-handed. That's right, Brother John. I remember that now. It's okay for us to be left-handed and right-handed, but when it comes to a protein, that's not okay. One destroys the other. Now, I hope the right-handed people never attack us, Brother John, and destroy us. They far outnumber us. But in the case of a protein, they can't both exist within this protein. Only the left-handed amino acids make up the proteins of life. Yes, lefties rule even at the very smallest levels. And just one right-handed molecule prevents the creation of proteins. It takes one. However, in this experiment, there were both. So what does that tell us about the experiment? There's a fourth thing that would not allow life to come about in this experiment. So not only was it the oxygen, not only was it the electricity, not only was it what was the third one? Not only was it the goo that was produced, that was poisonous, right? But it was also the fact that it produced the wrong kind of amino acids that canceled out the correct kind of amino acids. There's no function that they can point to, no availability of information that says how we can only produce left-handed amino acids in an environment. That is a miracle. Because random chance brings about both. Actually, it's not even random chance, right? So it's all applied intelligence anyway. We're kind of beyond that argument a little bit. They created both types. All right, so Stephen Grocott, PhD, organometallic chemistry. This one smart guy. I would not want to get into a battle of the brains with him, Ethan. He's a pretty smart guy, right? How many of us know what organometallic chemistry is anyway, really? I can make a good guess maybe, but who knows? Sounds smart. He said this: sterilize a frog and put it in a sterile blender. Buzz. Seal up the mixture in a sterile container and leave it as long as you want. You won't get life, despite the fact that you started with the best possible mixture of so-called precursors to life. Repeat the experiment 1,000,000 times, in the sun, in the dark, with oxygen, without, with clay, without, with UV, without. It won't make any difference. Thermodynamics clearly states that the mixture will decompose to simpler, lower energy, less information containing molecules. Now, if that doesn't tell you that life is a miracle, I don't know what else is. Just because you have all the products for life does not mean life is even there. Again, sterilize a frog, throw them in a blender. It's never going to turn into life. You can sit it there for 1 billion years, and what's it going to do? It's going to break down into more simple chemicals, just because that's what the second law of thermodynamics demands that it does. That is a law of our universe. It's a good explanation. Even if some type of life could be made in a test tube, guess what? We already kind of gave this one away. I created life in a test tube. Well, congratulations. You applied intelligent design in order to create life. Therefore, we have just proved that life must have come about by intelligent design. Thank you for that experiment. Michael Behe, PhD, in his book Darwin's Black Box, which you'll recognize having been mentioned several times. He said this: making the molecules of life by chemical processes outside of a cell is actually rather easy. Not only can amino acids and nucleotides be made, but a chemist can then take these and produce proteins and nucleic acids. Most readers will quickly see the problem. There were no chemists 4 billion years ago. Neither were there any chemical supply houses, distillation flasks, nor any of the other devices that the modern chemist uses in his or her laboratory and which are necessary to get good results. The fact is this, that if they did prove that they could produce life in a test tube, it would only prove intelligent design. That's the only thing it would prove. Sixthly, any questions on that, by the way? All right. Sixthly, the modern science of genetics has falsified the idea of life arising from non-life for those that have eyes to see. Stephen Grocott, remember him? He said this. He said, "I enjoy seeing the mental gymnastics of people trying to explain the origin of life. Most researchers in the area are honest enough to say they haven't got the faintest idea how life began from non-life. The mind boggles at the complexity of the simplest single-cell organism, and the more we learn, the more complex it looks." Philip E. Johnson in Darwin on Trial, he said the simplest organism capable of independent life, the prokaryote bacterial cell, is a masterpiece of miniaturized complexity, which makes a spaceship seem rather low-tech. One cell. We took a look at the cell last semester and showed how complex it really was. That's fascinating. Fascinating to me. In Darwin's day, the cell was thought to be a simple blob of protoplasm. Now, this is going to come into play with regard to the Miller experiment and the origin of life here in just a minute. Ernst Haeckel, remember him? The guy that faked the drawings, by the way, was caught faking the drawings, managed to somehow keep his job, and has been thoroughly discredited not only on evolution in terms of the embryos, but also in this area. He called it a simple little lump of albuminous combination of carbon. All right? So here he's going to scientifically explain to you what the first cell looked like. Therefore, it was not difficult for Haeckel to believe that life is constantly forming in the mud at the bottom of the sea. He called this Monera, and he believed it formed the base of the tree of life. So what he's doing, he's starting out, he's saying, Monera, these are the simplest forms of life. This is what everything evolved from, to make it, to put it simply. And we'll recall that Ernst Haeckel was one of Darwin's German disciples, and he wrote a book called The History of Creation, and in that he actually described the appearance, the eating habits, the reproductive cycle of Monera. He even drew pictures of them. They consist entirely of shapeless, simple, homogeneous matter. A shapeless, mobile little lump of mucus or slime. Organisms without organs. So he had this thing together, right? This whole entire story, a just so story. He had all stuck together. This is how it happened. And he's stating it as if it was fact. Today we know that the simplest living cell is more complicated than a modern city. New York City, nothing like one of your cells. One of your cells. With the mitochondria, the little factories, the little information transport, the copiers, it's just amazing what is in our cells with regard to that. Oh, by the way, Haeckel actually ended up giving this little thing called a Monera, he gave it a scientific name. This is completely fictional. He made up the entire thing. But he even gave it a scientific name and classification to make this appear like it was science. This guy was a fraud through and through with regard to his science. So this was called Protamoeba primitivia. That wasn't even very creative. Thank you, Mr. Haeckel. So this was supposed to be the first amoeba. It was primitive. I guess, in Latin. I don't know. Like I said, we know that the simplest living cell is more complicated than a modern city. Yeah, you've got the membrane, the nucleus, the nuclear membrane. You can just so many different things that you have in just the simplest cell. Now this is a single cell organism, and it's going to have blueprints. It's going to have decoders. It's going to have error checkers, quality control systems, power plants, power storage units, manufacturing plants, chemical plants, assembly lines, disposal units, trash compactors, and I'll add a few for you. How about the fact that it pushes trash onto the outside of the cell to be carried away by the fluid that surrounds the cell? How about the fact that the cell contains DNA and RNA, which show all of the different ways in which not only the cell should act, but the body of the organism as a unit. Just amazing, fascinating things. It's a beautiful, wonderful thing. But it's certainly different than what Haeckel and Darwin thought that it was. To me, that doesn't really look like a little organless body of protoplasm. No, it's very complex. They didn't understand. They didn't realize the complexity. Now, we can say 150 years on, this looks foolish. Whoops. Not only did he miss, he made it up in this entire story about I was going to say a Moderna, but that's like modern. About this little thing that he had here. An entire story about Monera. Amazing thing. Cell has complex communication systems, recycling centers, detoxification plants, transportation highways, tracks and tunnels, transportation vehicles, living walls with many types of one-way and two-way, guarded, gated portals to the outside world, an external matrix to connect with other cells, and a host of other things. That's the cell. Michael Denton, a PhD in biochemistry, he said this. He said, nearly every feature of our own advanced machines has an analog in the cell. Artificial languages and their decoding systems, memory banks for information storage and retrieval. They could have never known this. Henry Zuhl, PhD in biology, he said this also, elegant control systems regulating the automated assembly of parts and components. Amazing how fascinating this is. Error safe. Error fail-safe and proofreading devices utilized for quality control. Assembly processes involved in the principle of prefabrication of modular construction. There are bacteria, single-celled organisms that have corkscrew engines on them. With every part that we would have on our own that we would build. Bushings, for instance. Universal joints. No, really?
Yeah.
Fascinating, isn't it? Isn't that amazing? It's amazing! I think we took a look at some pictures last year. So it's got all this stuff. Only they knew. It's not just a big bag of proteins, which is what they thought it was, essentially.
That's what they had in their head. Do that protein.
They did, and then they built an entire universe of descriptions, and even going down to name the thing with a scientific Latin classification name. Proamoeba primaverita, or whatever it was. Anyway, Jerry Bergman, PhD in biology, even a simple E. coli bacteria has about 4,640,000 nucleotide base pairs, which code for 4,288 genes, each of which produces an enormously complex protein machine. Without that protein machine, you don't have life. The information in the DNA for one human cell is equivalent to a library of 4,000 books, each containing 500 pages. That's one cell. Anybody remember how many cells we have from last year? It was a while. 1.5 trillion? Something like that?
Probably more.
It's a lot.
Probably more than that.
A lot. So amazingly micro-engineered the cell is that all of the DNA from every person who has ever lived would weigh less than an aspirin. I should have brought an aspirin in with me. Yes, yes.
I'm sorry, what was the stats on the previous one?
Oh, that's okay. I can go back. 4,000 books, each containing 500 pages.
Thank you.
One cell. DNA of every person who has ever lived on the planet was way less than an aspirin.
What?
Yeah.
Just sunk in.
It's hard to imagine that.
Yeah.
That's pretty good engineering, I think. Pretty good engineering. Knowledge of these things forced many scientists to the conclusion that life could not have arisen spontaneously. Well, congratulations on that. You finally caught up with old what's-his-name, who finally decided to put a cloth over a piece of meat and see if any maggots would show up on it, and left one open, and maggots did show up on it to show that life couldn't come from nothing. The evolutionists want you to believe that life came from nothing. That life came from non-life. They actually expect you to believe this. Finally, they're starting to catch up. Oh, you know what? I guess life does have to come from something. I don't know. Henry Zool, PhD in biology. Complexity of the cell is now just too daunting to flippantly assert biochemical evolution to explain it. And if cells could not originate naturally, then nothing else could. A cell is the basic unit of life, right? That's the basic, you have single-celled organisms being the most basic part of life. Francis Crick, this guy is the co-discoverer of DNA's double helix structure. He says this in 1981, an honest man armed with all the knowledge available to us now could only state that in some sense the origin of life appears at the moment to be almost a miracle. It's because they couldn't figure out a way, right? You can't figure out a way. Could you imagine being the first one? Could you imagine being this guy and saying, wow, there's something here that is actually telling everything what to do. It's acting as a blueprint. Let's look for it. And then they find it. And it's a 4,000 book library of information in a single cell. And they go, oh, where did this come from? This is information. Oh, it just went out of it. I mean, it blew his mind, right? Almost to the point to where he's saying, look, there's got to be some way else that all of life came about. And it can't be just through chance. Sir Fred Hoyle is a very interesting guy. And I do a message sometimes on evolution versus creationism. And Sir Fred Hoyle is one of my statistics in there. And I forget what the exact number that he gives, but the chance of life coming about, he actually went and figured it out. And it was something that was so utterly impossible. It caused him to not believe that evolution was true. He said this, the notion that not only the biopolymers of an operating program of a living cell could be arrived at by chance in a primordial soup here on Earth is nonsense of the highest order. Sir Fred Hoyle, this guy is like major mathematician, okay? Way beyond the realm of possibility that evolution would have happened. It's not even figurable. Every evolutionary origin of life theory has the same fatal flaw as the ones that we have been taking a look at. Not a single one of these theories can bridge the vast barrier from life to non-life, from inert chemicals to living self-replicating systems. They all have the same thing to overcome, and that's the impossibility of it happening without actually applying intelligence to it. There's an RNA first theory that you may have heard about. This is the RNA, since it's simpler, must have come about then before the DNA, which is more complex. And some simple single-celled organisms like bacteria only have RNA and do not have DNA. Therefore, they postulate that the RNA came about first. There's the peptide theory, the deep sea vent theory. That was an interesting one, actually. That's where they think that the sulfur coming up from the deep sea vents combined with other chemicals in the water in order to create the basic building blocks of life. The iron sulfur theory, which is actually related to the deep sea vent theory. The bubble theory, the clay theory, the autocatalysis, or autocatalysis theory, and all the others that are mentioned in science. The theories are more ridiculous than realistic, though. We have to see that. Because they have to have these, again, just so stories to where this is how it came about, and if we're going to replicate this, we have to have control over every aspect that can't come about by accident. I think Miller knew it couldn't come about, that life couldn't come about by accident, even with all the right stuff in place, and that's why he so firmly kept his hand on every single little detail and design that he had in his system. to bring about these amino acids. To propose a microsphere or a water bubble or a protobiont or a proteinoid or some other thing as a path toward life is meaningless because none of these are living, self-replicating things. These are all just like the Monera. In such scenarios, you're still left on the non-living side of the chasm. Life has not been breached when these things are brought up. They're as mythical as Haeckel's Monera. Maybe we should give them scientific names as well. So they tried to produce life in a test tube. They failed. Ultimately, if they would have produced life in a test tube, they would have failed. Because it would have proven that intelligent design was necessary for life to come about. So either way, they prove intelligent design. So maybe they ought to stop trying to make life in a test tube because all it does is prove our side. If they're right, or if they're successful, they prove our side. If they're unsuccessful, they prove our side. Logically speaking, it doesn't make sense for them to continue. There's an excellent discussion of the Miller experiment in the book of Pandas and People. The Miller experiment in every evolutionary origin of life scenario, they point out the bankruptcy of the doctrine, and actually there's a disqualification here. If you're gonna be this shoddy with your science, you don't get to call yourself a scientist. You know? When you've already come up with your predetermined theory, you've already decided that regardless of what the results that come out, that of an experiment, you will find the proper mixture, even if you have to tweak it until you find it. In order to confirm your bias, you've already lost the argument and you're no longer considered to be a scientist. You're hopeful. Certainly he was skilled at science, but as far as the application goes, this was a rather dishonest way to go about it. All right, do we have any questions about the Miller experiment? Casey?
I just have something so you said that you said all the statistics on how many cells are in the human body and everything.
Right.
And I figured out that the total amount of information in a human body equals 10 quadrillion books with 500 pages each.
That's a lot of information.
But only one moment.
4 billion years isn't long enough, is it?
You've rewritten all the time, too.
Yeah.
Cells,
Yeah.
And repaired and
Like trillions of times every second.
copied every time you get a new cell. Brother Randy, you're not the man you used to be. Literally, all your cells have replaced at this point in your life.
For 7 years.
So what makes up you? Interesting, huh?
If I'm getting so many new cells, why am I feeling older?
Your cells are being attacked by oxygen. Start calling you old proto-amoeba or something. All right.
So, I just have a question. So what are they trying to work backwards toward when they do the cloning and stuff? What are they trying to get to, what point?
When they're cloning,
Yeah.
what is the point of scientific cloning?
Well, I know they're trying to make another
Right.
copy of whatever's there.
Perfect copy of another animal.
Right, but, I mean, isn't their end goal to make life nothing? How I guess, how does that?
If it was, then, they're starting with a fully formed organism, so that's kind of cheating. Like the old joke, God told them to get their own dirt. So if that's their point in that, I think usually the point though in cloning is for medical things in order to discover ways to fight diseases. I think it's the purpose of cloning. We all know though that they're really going to use cloning to create an army of monsters to come in to attack us. That's the ultimate goal. Ethan's back to life. I'm joking.
What do you mean by cloning? Like actual species?
Like taking the DNA out of an animal and then inserting it into the egg of business and that. Does anybody remember Dolly the sheep?
You
Yeah,
can have
she
your
didn't
own.
live very long.
You can have your pet done for $10,000.
So you'd be able to have
Oh,
kids
your
done.
pet.
Well, the accused us of having a cloning laboratory in the basement, but
I seen a show not real long ago, this English guy who's a big polo player. And he had one horse that was really special. He said in the course of a polo game, that guy will use several horses because one horse can't last that long. And he took that one special horse and he has cloned that, he's got 30 or 40 horses cloned off of that one. They all look exactly alike. And they're working for it.
that would be weird. Imagine a clone of yourself.
But he's got all these horses that look exactly alike, and he pushes them out and uses them, they work very well.
Now, mothers don't get any ideas. So still a bad idea, I think.
Hey, God created clones a long time ago when he made twins.
But,
Well, there you go.
He's
Yeah.
on really not.
That's right, and boy, that was a terrible thing.
I don't think he knows how well those horses live longer and.
Well, they'll get good at it. And the designer kids are coming. So. Not good. Even so, the Lord come quickly. Anyway, any more questions about the Miller experiment? Okay, well, if you come up with any, let me know next week. And otherwise, the quizzes are over here if you want to get one on your way out. Brother Hanson had a funeral to do tomorrow, getting the church set up for tonight, and so he wasn't able to come over. So anyway, we're done, so let's go ahead and close with a word of prayer. Brother Mike, if you would do that for us, thank you.
Lord, we just thank you, Lord, and praise you, God, that you're the creator of all things, Lord, and we give you praise and honor and majesty and glory for that. Just, Lord, I pray that you would help us to be knowledgeable of these things, Lord, and firmly convinced, dear God, more than ever, that you are the author and creator of all things, and about this science falsely so-called, Lord, help us to be able, Lord, to debate this topic, to bring glory to Christ. In Jesus' name we pray. Amen.
Amen. All right.
What's the next step up?
Okay.
No.
No, since
Boy,
we
he's gonna run you the next week.
so I think quad, whatever comes after quad.
4 of those.
You have people club?
Yes.
Really?
Casey, would you mind stopping?
Have they done it?
Isn't it?
You take DNA out of